Hello there, welcome to Bryan Lomax Movie Talk. The Batman talk is not over yet. We got another ranking video. Just when you thought they may have all been over, we're back with another one. And when I say we, I mean both me and, of course, Cody Leach. Cody Leach is doing this along with me. This is a collaboration between the two of us. So if you've not seen his video yet already, once you've watched this, do head on over to his channel and watch his video as well. What we're doing this time around is we are ranking all of the Batman villains from all the live action movies. So no animated stuff, just the live action movies. And there are a few rules. I don't know if Cody is instigating the same. In fact, I'm pretty sure Cody's not instigating the same rules. He doesn't have as many villains on his list as I do, but I had a few niggles that wouldn't leave me alone, and therefore I had to create certain rules with regards to who I decided to let upon my list. Because it doesn't matter how many villains you do or which ones you include or don't include, someone will always be disgruntled. So this is the rules for someone being on this list. Number 1, Bruce Wayne or Batman must have at least one face-to-face encounter with the villain. Number 2, said villain's machinations must somehow negatively impact Bruce or Batman's life, whether that be through physical, mental, or intellectual confrontation. And number 3, said villain must be name-checked at some point during the movie. So there you go. So, obviously Batman goes up against a lot of grunts, a lot of bad guys. You think about the warehouse fight in BVS, you can't name each and every one of those guys that he goes up against because he has a confrontation with them. But they're nameless faces. That being said, you have the parademons, which are like a horde of nameless faces, but they do have a name. They're parademons. They're from the comic books. They're an actual villain that Batman and the Justice League have faced many times. So they're a bit more tangible. You can put a name to what they are, and he goes up against them. So they are included. You've got characters like Stryver in The Dark Knight Rises, who is a villain, but never once does he come face to face with Batman. He's an antagonist towards Catwoman, towards Selina Kyle, but never has a run-in with Batman. So he doesn't make the list. So hopefully that makes things clear. And now that I've cleared that up, we're going to get straight into it. I'm not going to go on too much about each of these because, one, I did my Tim Burton villains ranking recently. I also did my Christopher Nolan villains ranking recently, so there's no point going over all the same stuff again and again and again. If you want to know a bit more in-depth thoughts on each of those villains, head on over to those videos. There's 38 villains on this list altogether. Let's rank them worst to best. Here goes. Number 38 is Bane from Batman and Robin. Yeah, absolutely atrocious rendition of a character which, quite frankly, was the biggest Batman villain in 90s comic books and has been one of the biggest Batman villains ever since, both from an intellectual and a physical standpoint. Here, he's just a grunt, a lackey. Number 37 is George A. Romero's Joker from the 1966 movie. I'm sure this will ruffle a few feathers, but to me, I was never that big a fan of Romero's portrayal of the Joker, to be perfectly honest. The lack of commitment to the role, the refusal to get rid of the moustache, was always a bugbear for me, quite frankly. You get to play a character of this high profile and you refuse to shave your moustache. All right, move along. And also, he's just a laughing man. That's all I get mostly from his portrayal. He doesn't have like the playfulness of Burgess Meredith's Penguin or the gleeful kind of maniacal nature of Frank Gorshin's Riddler. Number 36 is Uma Thurman's Poison Ivy, again from Batman and Robin. Mostly in the way that Uma Thurman plays it. I think her performance is terrible. It's one of the worst performances she's ever given, to be honest. I don't think she looks all that sexy, even though she's supposed to, because of the character. It's just, the whole thing's a mess. The costumes are garish, the dialogue is terrible, and her plan really doesn't make sense to team up with the one villain who actually is his ideology and his plan would completely go against everything that you want. Speaking of which, number 35, we've got Mr. Freeze, again from Batman and Robin. Yeah, he's just puns, innit? Pun City. I can have entertainment with Mr. Freeze. I can have entertainment watching Batman and Robin, but only because it's so bad that it's good. There's no character here. There's no dialogue. It's just pun after pun after pun, and that's fine for like 60s TV show inspired material, but in this day and age, it doesn't really cut it. Number 34 is Burgess Meredith's Penguin from the 66 movie. I like what Meredith brings to this role for the 60s TV show, but as I said in my ranking of the movies, it works as a 20-minute TV show. It doesn't work as a 90-minute, 2-hour movie. It's definitely more for the kids, the family, and I love the show for that. I can watch it with my family in that setting. But if we're measuring it up against the rest of the people on this list, yeah, it's quaint, but that's about it. The same can be said of number 33, which is Lee Meriwether's Catwoman, again, 60s Batman movie. It's the gimmick thing, isn't it? Back then, these people weren't characters in the 60s show and in the movie. They weren't really characters. They were caricatures. They obviously had a theme built around the character. And, you know, Penguin would look like a penguin. He'd waddle like a penguin. He'd go, wah, wah, this, that, and the other. And Catwoman, we get, yeah, she purrs like a cat. She meows like a cat. Again, it's quaint. There's nothing particularly wrong with the performance with regards to how it fits within the world that is created by the 60s TV show. It's just that once you start measuring these with the you know the proper Batman movies, today's Batman movies, then they're somewhat lacking. Number 32 is Tommy Lee Jones's Two-Face, who feels very much like he fits within the 60s TV show, you know, along with, as I've said, the Batman and Robin villains. Again, it's the gimmick. He's Two-Face. He's got a split personality. Everything he does is in twos. His suit is in half. He robs the Second National Bank of Gotham on the 2nd anniversary that he was created. All that kind of stuff. It's like, again, it's not a character. It's a gimmick, and you just hammer that gimmick home until it's, yeah. Where else do you go with it? And seeing an actor of Tommy Lee Jones's caliber having to kind of fight with that and contend with that is just like, oh. Number 31 is Frank Gorshin's Riddler. Probably my favourite villain of the 60s TV show, to be honest, just because of Frank Gorshin's performance. He is the precedent for Jim Carrey, basically. He sets out the stall for which, you know, Jim Carrey would pick up the baton. I think Jim Carrey understood very well what Schumacher was doing with his movie, aping the 60s TV series, and he apes what Frank Gorshin brings us here, which is just totally off the wall, maniacal, mental, full of energy. This guy's like a coiled spring that's just been let off. Character-wise, it's still all gimmick thing that all of these villains from the 60s show kind of suffer from, which is why he's so far down on the list. But from a performance standpoint, you know, there's no George Romero kind of, I'm an actor, I refuse to shave my moustache, this, that, and the other. No, Gorshin saw what the character was, saw what it needed, and committed wholeheartedly. Number 30 for me is the Parademons from both Batman vs Superman and Justice League, both versions. Yeah, you know, they're not much of a character, but they are quite a fierce, ferocious, demonic-looking kind of, yeah, alien race. They're basically the worker ants that go out, do all the grunt work, and prepare for an alien invasion. But we get to see Batman, you know, tackling these head on, getting into full on, you know, confrontations with these guys. So they count as far as I'm concerned. You know, they go up against all of the Justice League, and they're basically like a swarm. You know, that's how they work in numbers. But as I say, the only reason they're not any higher is because they're not. Beyond that, they don't really have much character to speak of. I just like the design of them. You know, I think the design is very faithful to what we got in the comic books, and that they are like something out of a horror movie. And number 29 for me is Victor Zsasz, played by Tim Booth from Batman Begins. This guy would be much higher on the list if he actually got more screen time. He's essentially a glorified cameo, a nod, a wink to the fans. But even in the short kind of amount that we get, I would much rather watch his scenes over and over again than the villains that have come before him. And I think that primarily comes from my love of the character from the comic books. As I've said before, when I first saw this in the cinema, I was literally the one in the audience who shouted out, "It's us! Played by Tim Booth!" It was a great experience for me. I just looked like a nutter though, unfortunately. And number 28 is Anatoly Knyazev. Who, you ask? He's in Batman vs Superman. He is the guy who basically holds Martha hostage with a flamethrower. I think to a lot of people he's just generic bad guy number 2, whatever. But because of the name, if you're a comic book fan, you know who this guy is. In the comic books, he's KG Beast. Obviously, they couldn't call him KG Beast in this because we're long past KGB era. That just as a villain, KG Beast is proper outdated now. He's kind of how do you bring a villain called the KG Beast into the modern world? He's a favourite of mine from that era. You know, the 80s and the 90s. KG Beast was a really great villain. From the story 10 Nights of the Beast, quite a famous Batman story. And it was just good to see the nod. And he is, he's still a proper character. He pops up throughout the film doing villainous things. The only thing is that we don't get a right lot of history on this guy. We don't really know who he is. He is just he's a hired gun. If he didn't have that name, if I didn't know who this was from the comic books, then he'd probably be under Zsasz. But because he gets more screen time than Zsasz, he does a bit more than Zsasz, then that kind of places him a bit higher, really. And again, like the reason he's higher than the likes of Mr. Freeze and all them lot is because he actually feels like a real person. Even though we don't really know him, know who he is, he still feels like a real world person rather than a bad pun. At number 27, we get Steppenwolf from the 2017 Justice League. Now, Steppenwolf I'm counting twice, obviously the 2017 version and the Zack Snyder's Justice League cut. I'm not counting like the Parademons or KG Beast because they don't really change, to be honest. Regardless of which cut you're in, there isn't really a drastic change as to what they do within the context of the story. They remain who they are either way. Steppenwolf, on the other hand, is a completely different matter. Right down from the look, for a start, he looks completely different in the 2017 cut with unfinished CGI. And there's very little motive. He's a world invader. That's it. He wants power. That's it. He's your average Marvel villain back when Marvel weren't doing villains all that well. At number 26 is Eric Roberts' Sal Maroni. This is basically Carmine Falcone Mark II, only he doesn't quite have as much impact. Mostly because he's supposed to be the big bad gangster in Gotham at this point. But as the film goes on, he gets less and less menacing because everything else around him seems to be much bigger than he can handle. So, but beyond that, he's your bog standard gangster type. There is a really badass moment, though, in which Batman throws Maroni off a building. Maroni's kind of giving him some stick for it, saying, from this height, you're not going to kill me. And Batman's like, yeah, I know, bye. So, that's quite a cool moment. And Maroni's quite a badass, for sticking up to Batman in that moment. He tells Batman that he knows he won't kill. So, Yeah, so for that reason, he scores some brownie points. And number 25 is Daggett, played by Ben Mendelsohn in The Dark Knight Rises. So this is your corporate douchebag villain. He manages to cause some damage, though. He is essentially the one responsible for making Bruce Wayne lose all his money and be kind of almost cast out of Wayne Enterprises. So for that alone, he does some considerable damage to Bruce / Batman. It's just ultimately he just ends up being a lackey for Bane. He doesn't realise it. He thinks he's the man in charge, and that makes for a rather amusing sequence halfway through the film. But yeah, either way, he still does some damage from a more kind of political, financial side of things. Number 24 is Doomsday from Batman v Superman. Both cuts, as I say, he doesn't really change a right lot between cuts, so he's only on here once. It's cool seeing Doomsday on screen. My one downside about BVS is I feel like they should have saved the Doomsday storyline for a film later down the line, left it to Batman v Superman going up against Lex. But it's still cool to see Doomsday on screen. It's still an epic fight sequence. And let's face it, that is kind of all you're going to get with Doomsday anyway. He's not much of a character to speak of in that regard. He's not a talker or a thinker. He's just destruction personified. And in that regard, Snyder does a pretty good job with him. Number 23 is Carmine Falcone from Batman Begins, played here by Tom Wilkinson. I like Tom Wilkinson. I like this character. I love Batman Begins, obviously. I always feel like perhaps the accent that Tom Wilkinson gave was a bit strong. This is still essentially the guy who is responsible for Batman being created. Without him, without the crime that he pours into Gotham City, there wouldn't be the likes of Joe Chill, and therefore Batman's parents wouldn't have died. And the first confrontation, the first meeting between Bruce Wayne and him is quite entertaining. Just seeing where Bruce is at, because that's what Falcone does. He kind of forces Bruce to look at himself, who he is, what he needs to do, where he needs to be, however many years from now, in order to do it. So yeah, he is essentially the man who starts Bruce Wayne down the path to becoming Batman. Number 22 is Max Schreck from Batman Returns, played brilliantly by Christopher Walken. I love Christopher Walken. He's one of those endlessly watchable actors. He for the longest time, he was that actor who was in so many bad films, but just as a cameo. And that was because he was a king of the cameo. Like that one scene he'd be in, that he'd be cameoing in, it'd be dynamite. The only thing I'd say against him is that, one, it's like he's not a character that originates from the comic books, but he is essentially the main villain to a large degree in Batman Returns. And three, he is essentially just, again, the corporate douchebag. But he does play the corporate douchebag so well. Number 21 is Danny DeVito's Penguin. I like Danny DeVito's Penguin. I think he's a solid villain. I think the fact that he got a Raspberry Award, or at least a nomination, was preposterous. He's just a monstrous creation that has a small modicum of sympathy. Number 20 is Jim Carrey's Riddler. This is Frank Gorshin turned to 11. In all fairness, the two of them could definitely give each other a run for the money. I just find Jim Carrey a bit more watchable to me. He doesn't quite grate on my nerves as much. There are times when Gorshin he does a little bit. He's still great, but there are times. Whereas Carrey is just, he's very entertaining, very entertaining. His buffoonery, his unsanctioned buffoonery, is highly entertaining. Number 19 is Ray Porter's Darkseid. Now, this is the one on the list that comes closest to not really making it, and I did and ah about doing it. Is there a real confrontation between Batman and Darkseid? Well, everything that they are trying to stop, everything they are fighting for in Zack Snyder's Justice League is in order to stop ultimately Darkseid. I know it is to stop Steppenwolf, but ultimately Steppenwolf is an extension of Darkseid's power. And there is that final shot at the end where all of them, having just defeated Steppenwolf and stopped Darkseid's plans, they're all kind of staring at him through that hole, essentially saying, you know, we've just thrown down the glove. Come and have it, bitch. Number 18 is Zoe Kravitz's Catwoman. Now, I was very reluctant to put her on this list because she's not really a villain. Out of all the Catwomen that we've had, I would say she is the one who becomes an ally with Batman the soonest. Catwoman has always been that character who straddles that line between good and bad. You know, she breaks the law clearly in all her iterations, but deep down there's a good person inside who's just trying to make the world better. She just doesn't always go the best way about it. She does have a confrontation with Batman. They have a fight sequence, and in that moment, Batman looks at her as a villain. You know, she's stealing from someone, so she's breaking the law. And then when he tries to stop her, she attacks him, and the two have a fight. So in that moment, for the briefest of moments, she is a villain. She kind of lives up to the tried and true history of the comic books, in which she goes, you know, flip-flopping from side to side. And even towards the end of the film, she does have some serious intent to do some villainous things. And it's up to Batman, really, to stop her from going down that path. Purely from a character standpoint, she would be higher. But as I'm ranking this on villains, it's very, very hard for me to just see her as a villain, because she isn't. So I've compensated either way, basically, which is why she kind of ends up being smack bang in the middle. And number 17 for me is Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor from Batman v Superman. I know a lot of people really don't like Eisenberg's Lex Luthor. I don't have a problem with it. I think there is room for this interpretation, big time. If you look at, you know, who would Lex Luthor be in the modern world? What shape would he most likely take? I think it would be your demented Mark Zuckerberg type. It makes sense to cast the guy who played Mark Zuckerberg and just say, look, go large. That's what he feels like to me. I get why that might irritate some people. You got this snot-nosed rich punk who's just like overdoing it. But that's his psychosis. You know, this is a guy who can get whatever he wants, whenever he wants. He's got delusions of grandeur. He almost believes himself to be a god, which is the reason he can't stomach Superman being in this world, because there is someone out there more powerful than he is. I like what they do with this guy, certainly on the page. I mean, even taking away what Zuckerberg brings, what Eisenberg brings to the role, just on the page as he is written, he's a very interesting character, and I think sometimes that gets overlooked because people don't like the performance. Now, I think he's a well-written character, but I also do happen to like the performance. For the most part, there are a couple of moments in it where I'm like, could have toned it down a little bit just in that moment. But for the most part, I like this guy. I think he's a good villain, interesting villain, and a refreshing take, I would say, on Lex Luthor. And number 16 is Jared Leto's Joker. Now, this is the one that I would not have expected to be this high up on the list. Now, if I was just going off Suicide Squad, he wouldn't. He would be a lot further down the list, considerably further down the list. And you might say, well, is the Suicide Squad Joker even the same Joker as as the Zack Snyder's Justice League Joker? This is a hard one to call with regards to whether he is or he isn't. I can only assume that he is. I know he doesn't have the tattoos in Snyder's version, but it was essentially Ayer who put Leto in the role. So you're kind of torn. Like even Zack Snyder is accepting that Leto is the Joker. So it's a tough one to call. Either way, Suicide Squad kind of makes me put Leto's Joker quite far down the list. Zack Snyder's Justice League does a lot, an awful lot, to make me shoot him up the list. And if we didn't have Suicide Squad, he would be further up even still, it must be said. Number 15 is Marion Cotillard's Talia al Ghul from The Dark Knight Rises. As I say, I've talked about her in the previous videos. Certainly on paper, she's a great villain. It was a bit too obvious because I was a Batman fan, you know, because I know the comic books all the way through. The first time I watched this, I was like, that's Talia al Ghul. It's Talia, yay, it's Talia al Ghul. So, yeah, I'd have liked a little bit more time with her as Talia al Ghul, but beyond that, she's a pretty good villain. She'd be a little bit higher if it weren't for that damn death scene. Number 14 is Anne Hathaway's Catwoman. Now, as I've already stated, when you have Catwoman, it's a bit difficult to call. She's on either side. But I think that, certainly for the first half of The Dark Knight Rises, she's a villain. You know, she's trying to clear her name. She's trying to get a clean slate. But you only need a clean slate if you've done things that need wiping away to begin with. So she's clearly done things that are wrong. When she's first introduced to Bruce Wayne, she knocks him down on the floor. She's responsible for setting him up in regards to the confrontation with Bane. So she does damage. You know, the villainous actions that she does when she's playing the villain actually do some serious damage to Batman. Thankfully, she turns herself around and redeems herself at the end, which is why I think it's right that she is the one who gets to take out Bane with a cannon. I know a lot of people have real issue with that, but it's right to me. From a story standpoint, a character standpoint, Batman ain't going to kill him. So who is? Who's going to take him out of the picture? It has to be Catwoman. And number 13 is the Zack Snyder's Justice League version of Steppenwolf. Much better villain. much better villain. The CGI looks immeasurably superior, it's got to be said, and the guy is fleshed out considerably as well. Rather than just this world-dominating douchebag, we get someone who's trying to redeem himself in the eyes of the one that he works for. He's been cast out. He's an outcast. And he's doing all of this stuff to try and work his way back into the graces of the one he kneels before, essentially his god. Instantly, a lot more character to this guy. There is a very, very small element of, like, you know, a sympathy towards him that you can have, given the position he's in. But ultimately, he's still a villain. But he's also quite a badass, you know? It takes the whole Justice League going up against him. Well, it takes Superman, basically. It takes bringing Superman back to put this guy down. Batman, once again, he's involved in the final confrontation. He is instrumental in the plans of action that are put into motion in order to stop Steppenwolf. Number 12 is Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn, who has appeared in 3 movies so far: Suicide Squad, The Suicide Squad, and Harley Quinn, obviously. Now, I love Harley Quinn, the movie, you know, Fabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn. Birds of Prey, I should say. I love it. I really do. I think she's a great character in that movie. I think that's the best version we've had of her in regards to Margot Robbie's performance. I think that movie is incredibly underrated. Now, she does get to have a bit of a confrontation with Batman in the first Suicide Squad movie, so she full on counts as a Batman villain, not to mention her ties with the Joker. So it all qualifies. Admittedly, in the majority of the movies we've seen her in, the majority of the running time, Batman is nowhere to be seen. But we know that they have had run-ins before. We see one of them, so she counts. And as a character, she's very entertaining. Number 11 is John Turturro's Carmine Falcone. This is the guy from the comic books. I've always been a bit hit and miss with John Turturro. For the most part, he did a lot of wacky stuff. You know, like what he does in Transformers. He for quite a while he just did that kind of thing. I saw him fairly recently in a film directed by Robert Redford, Quiz Show, and I thought he was fantastic in that. It was one of the best things I'd seen him in. outside of some of the Coen brothers stuff that he does. But here, nailed it. Absolutely nailed it. He's menacing, but he's also got this sense of history, of having a deep, rich history within Gotham. He feels like a part of the very fabric of Gotham. He's a slime bag. He's underhanded, but he kind of he knows how to make it look or seem as though he's got a bit of class. He is essentially the main villain of The Batman. I think most people will say the Riddler, but the Riddler is a reactionary character. He is he's a reaction to, in much the same way Batman was in Batman Begins to Carmine Falcone, so is Riddler to Carmine Falcone. Number 10 is Aaron Eckhart's Two-Face from The Dark Knight. Just a really solid character arc. We get to see much of him as the White Knight and not quite as much as I'd like as Two-Face. That's the only reason he's a bit further down. But as far as any of the villains go on this list, he has one of the most solid character arcs. Seeing him go from the absolute top of being good to the absolute bottom of being twisted and vengeful and spiteful. It's such a fall from grace, and it's very well handled. Number 9 is Cillian Murphy's Scarecrow. This guy is never a main villain in any of the Dark Knight trilogy movies, but he's the most fun, with possibly the exception of the Joker. I just love what Cillian Murphy brings to it. I like that he just keeps popping up in the movies. He's just there in the background doing his thing. But I like as well what he brings to Batman Returns. Batman Begins. The theme of fear plays heavily with Scarecrow, so he's the perfect villain for that film. And the look of him, the design of him, is fantastic. Number 8 is Colin Farrell's Penguin from The Batman. I loved Farrell. I wish we'd had more screen time with him. That being said, he got all the screen time that he needed. Farrell nails it. And if you told me, or I should say, if you didn't tell me who that was playing the role before I saw the film, I would have no clue. No clue. Whoa! This guy's crazy! Disappears into that role. Absolutely brilliant. Immensely fun. Despite some of the wickedness he gets up to. And again, that's just because of the energy, the life that Farrell brings to the role. And I cannot wait to see the TV series that is going to be based on this character. Number 7 is Paul Dano's Riddler. Zodiac is one of my favourite movies of all time. He's very much inspired by the Zodiac Killer, particularly David Fincher's version of the Zodiac Killer. But he gets more screen time, and he plays with Batman with all his games, his mind games and stuff. He's clever, he's very intellectual, but also he's very pathetic. He's very, he's an outcast. He feels like the guy that society's disowned, and because of that, he gets back at society. He's bitter, he's twisted, and he wants the world to know him. Number 6 is Ra's al Ghul from Batman Begins. Very underrated villain, I think. Not as showy as the likes of Joker or Bane, but still, this is the guy who trained Batman. He goes up against Batman multiple times in a physical confrontation and actually comes out on top most of the time. So he's a formidable threat. This is someone who is on equal footing with Bruce, with Batman. Taught Batman the tricks of his trade. So yeah, I love Neeson's gravitas to any role he brings, even when he's just playing some random hitman type kind of role. The way he delivers his lines. There's a reason he voices Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia. He's got a very particular cadence to his voice that just commands respect, and that is perfect for a character like Ra's al Ghul. Number 5 is Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman, possibly my favourite female villain of all time. Mostly down to Pfeiffer, a lot down to that costume, it's got to be said, if I'm being perfectly honest. It's always been a favourite of mine. Batman Returns has always been a favourite of mine. Catwoman's always been a favourite of mine. I like the character journey, but I just feel like, in many other actors' hands, may not have worked, but Pfeiffer totally commits. totally commits to that role and, yeah, deserves all the credit she gets. Number 4 is Jack Nicholson's Joker from the 1989 Batman. Yeah, just, it's Nicholson being full-on Nicholson. Really great stuff. He's hilarious, he's scary, he's a ball of energy, he's unpredictable. He's a perfect flip side to the same coin as Batman. He's all the opposites to Batman, but you bring the two together, and it just creates fireworks. Nicholson set the standard basically for all comic book movie villains that would come after him, and for many years, many people tried to do that, a variation on what Nicholson did. It was the gold standard for so long. And number 3 is Joaquin Phoenix's Joker from the film Joker. And you're like, Batman isn't in that film though. Yeah, Bruce Wayne is though. Bruce Wayne is in the film, and they do have something of a confrontation, something of a mental. I feel like in the sequence in which Joker, well, I mean, he's not quite Joker yet. He's not there. But he goes, and the two of them have this thing where they've had a bit of a confrontation, and then directly because of Joker's actions, when he becomes Joker at the end of the film, Bruce Wayne's parents are killed. They are killed by someone who is part of the whole Joker kind of, response team, so to speak, for want of a better term. That's going to have a profound effect on Bruce Wayne's life trajectory. In the world of the Joker, of Todd Phillips' Joker is the reason that Batman is going to become Batman, that Bruce Wayne is going to become Batman. If Joker hadn't done what he did and stirred things up, riled people up, got people to do what they do at the end, Bruce Wayne's parents wouldn't have been shot. Therefore, Batman would not have been created. So in the film, Joker is directly responsible for the creation of Batman. Number 2 for me is Tom Hardy's Bane. Bane is my favourite villain from the comic books. Yes, even more so than the Joker. When you get him right, then he's just, one of the best villains. He's absolutely a physical threat, but also an intellectual threat for Batman. He ticks all the boxes. And when he's done right in the comic books, usually by the likes of Chuck Dixon, then he's my favourite villain. What Christopher Nolan does is he takes the essence of that character that made him so special in the comic books, and he puts it on screen. To look at, it's not necessarily the same character, but actually when you look at what Nolan's doing, and particularly with the story, breaking the inmates out of the prison, using a drug, may not call it venom, it may not be injected the same way, it may not be for the same reasons, but the strength, the intellect, are just, it's all there. It is the character from the comic books, and it's just brilliantly put. I love Bane. I love Tom Hardy's performance. On a different day, I would put him as my number 1. It depends what mood I'm in, I guess. But fantastic villain. But of course, my number 1, and I don't think there was any doubt as to where this was heading, it's Heath Ledger's Joker. I think this is the comic book villain of all time that will always be remembered as the number 1. Whatever faults you might find with The Dark Knight, I admit that it might not be the best film ever made, in the sense that objectively you can find flaws in it. Even I can find flaws in it. But subjectively, I don't care. The experience I have watching it is just the best experience I've ever had watching a movie. And for that reason, it's my favourite movie of all time, irrespective of whether it's the best. Despite all them flaws you might find, I don't think there's anyone who can say that one of those flaws is Heath Ledger's Joker. It's just nailed it. Nicholson set the bar. Nicholson set the tone, the standard of what you needed to do, what you needed to achieve as a comic book movie villain. Heath Ledger smashed it. Absolutely smashed it. So yeah, there you go. That is my ranking of all 38 villains that, that in some way have an impact on Batman's life, Bruce Wayne's life, or confront him in some way, yeah, throughout these live action movies. I will reiterate, Cody Leach is doing a similar list to this. He doesn't have quite as many on his list as I do, but go and check his list out, you know, and yeah. Thank you for watching this video. Let me know what your list looks like, and until next time, cracking.